analog gear is really great at being imperfect in cool ways. These subtle imperfections are where all of the cool sound of analog gear comes from. So for example, on a stereo mixer channel inside of like an analog mixer, even though they're manufactured to be almost identical, just because the electrical components are going to wear out and age in various different ways, the left and right channels may be slightly different from one another. There also may be subtle differences in those left and right channels just based on the way that they were handmade. Because of the subtle differences, you'll actually get various different frequency responses from each of the different channels, and even though it's very subtle, it can add this depth, this clarity, and this larger sound to your mix. And luckily now there's tons of cool analog plugins that exist that enable us to get that kind of sound in our mixes. So most of these will be a little bit more on the subtle side. They're not going to radically reshape your audio, just going to add that little bit of extra vibe to your sounds. So I recommend listening on a good set of headphones or studio speakers. The first plugin we'll be using in this video is going to be the Black Box Design HG2 distortion plugin. This is an emulation of an analog effects processor that's like a rack mount effect that is designed to kind of emulate what guitar effects pedals do, where you have different combinations you can make of distortion sounds, but to do that for a microphone preamp. So it's a very flexible mic pre essentially. What it enables us to do for our mixes is to really dial in the style of distortion that we want to add a lot of additional harmonics and texture to our audio. This plugin has a really excellent analog tone to it that can enhance your signals without radically changing them, because it's really trying to emulate like a microphone preamp rather than just like a distortion effect. So because of this subtlety, it enables us to really thicken up our audio and to add some of that analog saturation that we're looking for. There's two different versions of this. There's a version from Plugin Alliance, and then there's also a UAD accelerator version. So if you have a UAD sound card, you can also run this on the hardware as well. Both of them are developed by Brainworks, so you can use either of those whenever you're following along with this video, because they are the same plugin, just depends on how you want to run them. But I'll be using the native one from Plugin Alliance. So what I have here is our alternative rock track. We're taking a look now at the verse section instead of the main kind of more rock section. So that way I can show you how this can enhance something with some bass guitar, some electronic drums, and then also some multi-track guitars. So it just sounds like this. So I'll be showing you how to enhance this using this plugin. So let's first focus in on our bass guitar, because on bass, this plugin could really shine. So let's load it in. Let's type in Black Box Audio HG2. And by the way, there's actually two versions of this now. There's also a mid-side version as well. I'll just be using the regular one because I don't really use the mid-side distortion very often, but that is an option if you'd like to. Okay, so let's take a look at this bass before. So what we have is a DI signal here, and then we also have a mic layer as well. In the case of this example, I actually like the tone of them when they were both playing together, so I'll actually be using both of these busts together, but you could use one of the individual ones if you wanted. Okay, so let's take a look at our plugin here, turn it on. So the interface looks a little bit convoluted, but it's actually quite simple. Basically, there is a saturation section. There's a pentode distortion, which is one style of harmonics. There is a triode distortion, an air circuit that kind of almost adds a little bit of top-end sizzle to everything. And then there's just an output knob. You also have the option to blend this in parallel, which can be really nice, especially on buses. Okay, so then let's go ahead and take a look at how this works. So I want to first add in some saturation. So I'm going to click on this button right here, which is going to enable the saturation circuit. And let's go ahead and mess around with this until we get the sound we're looking for. So especially with this bass, we can actually drive this pretty hard. So let's go ahead and saturate that quite a bit. And let's add in some pentode distortion. So this is one style of harmonics. I believe these are even harmonics and these ones are odd harmonics. They have their own tone to them. So these ones are almost more mid-range focused, and these have a little bit more high frequency focus. And because we can blend them both together, it gives us the option to really kind of dial in the sound we're looking for. Because what this is doing is just emulating a microphone preamp, but giving us the option to adjust various different styles of distortion and saturation. Additionally, we also have the saturation frequency control. You can kind of think of this as like a tone shaper. So if we're driving this really hard, and I want this to be more low frequency focused, I can swap this over to lows. And it's going to go ahead and bias everything, so now we have more low frequencies and less highs. Alternatively, if we put this over to high frequency, now it's going to be more focused on high frequencies. So it just depends on what you're working with. I think for this given sound, I do like flat because I do want some of those high frequencies from my bass. So also maybe go down and take down the output just a little bit so it's not quite as loud. And let's add in some triode distortion. That kind of brings out some of that snap on the top end of the bass. See how it kind of just lifts up that bass? It's not radically transforming the overall sound. It's just adding this fullness and a little bit of this saturation that really brings some life into my bass guitar. Last thing I'll do is go ahead and just enable the air circuit, because by default it won't do anything unless you have it enabled. And then we can go ahead and push this up to give us a little bit of additional high end on our sound. So the effect is really subtle here. Depending on how much high frequency information you're feeding into your signals, this may be a little bit more apparent, but on this bass, because we don't have tons of highs, it's a little bit more of a soft effect. But what that's doing is just adding a touch of air back into the signal, and it kind of just lifts everything up slightly. Now the final control that we have on here is going to be this alternative tube option. What this enables us to do is swap to a different style of tube saturation, so basically just swapping out the tubes. So it gives us a slightly different tone. So in the case of this example, that alternative tube adds a little bit of extra high frequencies and snap to my signal. So in this one, it's actually super nice sounding. So before, our bass sounded like this, and after. So it just adds a subtle bit of life back to that bass. Giving us a slightly more saturated and interesting tone. So subtle effects processors like the HD2 are really helpful for adding in just a little bit of extra analog saturation and vibe to your audio, because it can really enhance the overall flavor of everything without like radically transforming how the bass sounds. Now I want to take a look at how a master bus processor called the God particle could be used to enhance your mixes on individual tracks to give you some of that analog flavor. So this is actually a super interesting plugin. I'll go ahead and pull it up here. It's loaded on a couple different sections of this track. What this plugin is an all-in-one master bus processor that's designed to emulate a lot of analog gear. So traditionally this is used on the 2 bus, so going to be your main mix bus down here at the bottom in Ableton, or your master channel if you're in another DAW. But what you could do is use this on individual tracks as well to enhance the overall flavor of those tracks and to add in some additional processing. So this plugin was designed by a company called Cradle Audio and a mixing engineer whose name is Jason Joshua. He's a really big mixing engineer who's worked with Rihanna, Usher, Beyonce, and then a lot of more modern acts as well, like Bad Bunny and Rosalia. And what this plugin does is just emulates his mix bus setup that he used to use with a bunch of outboard hardware gear, and it does so in a really easy to use interface. And I find this plugin is really great too, even if you don't work in hip hop or R&B. I used it on a classical mix the other day that I was working on for a client that was a piano driven track, and it worked really, really well. So let me go ahead and show you the before and after on our track. Here we're working with an R&B example, and I have this loaded up on several of these different insert tracks, mainly these vocal cords, these drums, and then also my main keys bus. So let's take a look at this. So the difference that this plugin is giving us is it makes our mix sound a lot more open, a little bit more of that analog saturated texture, and it also just gives us more three-dimensional clarity and depth. So I'm gonna go ahead and remove this, and I could show you how this sounds on each of these individual tracks. So let's take it off on the vocal bus. Let's take it off on the drums, and let's then go down to our keys and also remove that because we'll load in a new copy of that here in a moment. So let's go ahead and first take a look at our drums, because that's going to be kind of the main section that you'll be able to hear the biggest change on. So I'm going to go ahead and loop those. That's just Command and L, by the way, or Control and L, in case you're curious. And let's go ahead and load up this plugin and take a look at it. So the interface looks a little bit different than you normally would get with an EQ or a compressor, because it's doing a lot of things all in one under the hood. Basically, the best way to think about this is it's combining a couple of different things. It has an adaptive limiter here at the end. It has some analog style saturation, multiband compression, and like a Pultec style EQ. So it's a bunch of things in one, but it sounds really nice, even just added on buses. So let's solo out these drums before and after. So it instantly enhances those drums, adding a ton of punch and clarity. That subtle analog saturation also adds this really nice texture to everything, giving us that punch and depth that you would get from an analog mixing console. So the way that this plugin works is you first want to go ahead and hit these indicators right here. You want to make sure that your audio is kind of within this green range. You need to hit this kind of range here so that way the plugin has the right gain staging, so that the limiting and the compression and everything are all working properly. So that's all you really need to worry about here, is you can go ahead and drive that input up if you need to, or reduce it if you have too much level. But for us, we're already hitting the sweet spot, so we can leave that input as is. The next main control that we have here is going to be the amount control. If you're using this on a master bus, traditionally you would just leave this at 100%. But for us, because we're using this on a drum track, we can kind of use it for some color. We could either use it at 200%, really add a lot of harmonics, or less. So I actually like that with quite a bit of saturation in this case, so let's push it up to 160. So that's giving us that higher percentage value. And then we could go ahead and move over to this other section right here. This is going to be the push-pull EQ. So this looks like a traditional 3-band EQ with highs, mids, and lows, but what this lets you do is push the audio signal into this processor. You can kind of think of this section as a multi-band processor. There's some compression, there's some EQ and saturation, and I can either push more highs into that, push more mids, or push more lows. Additionally, if we were getting too much bass, too much highs, or something like that, we could also remove them. So now we get less sub-frequencies being pushed into the signal, or I could push a lot of them. Kind of thicken up that kick. So maybe let's thicken up the kick a little bit. Add a little highs. 2.3 decibels there. And then that's going to be all for the push-pull EQ section. The next thing that we have over here on the right is going to be this gain reduction metering. What this is designed to be used for is whenever you're going through and driving a full mix into this plugin, you want to make sure that the lows are hitting within this box, that the mid-range is hitting within this box, and that the highs are hitting within this box. That way you're gain staging your mix properly. So if you had individual tracks, you could push them until they kind of hit these icons here. But because we're just using this more as a creative effect, this doesn't matter quite as much, because here I'm just using this as more of a color box rather than a full mix bus processor. So for us, we don't need to worry about that in this case, but that's what's happening with those meters. And then we have our adaptive limiter over here. If we wanted to turn that off, we could just turn off with that button. Or we could add it back in. And then if we want more limiting, push that up. Or less limiting, you could reduce it. I kind of like that little bit of limiting on the drums. It's only grabbing like that snare. So it sounds nice. Now let's go ahead and reduce the output as well, so that way everything is level matched. Let's see how that sounds in context. See how much more energy and punch those drums have? Now they really sit within that mix, but also have this really nice texture to the high frequencies because of that really nice analog modeled saturation. So this plugin is really interesting on individual buses and tracks. Let's then take this and apply this over to our keys and our vocal layer. So let's jump into our main keys bus here. And let's apply the God particle. So we'll just click on that and drag and drop that in. And then we can go ahead and get started on this track. So I think with this one, I even like that just at 100%. That sounds really nice. Let's go ahead and just push more high frequencies into the processor. So that way I'm kind of shaping the signal before it hits all this processing. Kind of just livens up those keys a little bit. Let's pull back some of that bass information and a touch of those mids. And then we could go ahead and level match everything. So it kind of just brightens up those keys, makes them sound a little bit more alive, but also gives you that nice texturing. Okay, then let's go ahead and jump back into our vocal cord layer here. You can just fold that up, and we'll grab another copy of the God particle. And go ahead and load that up onto the track. Close up some of these devices we have here. Then we can go ahead and start playing around with our signal. So I like that tone, but let's go ahead and start messing with it. So let's maybe push all of our high frequencies up quite a bit in the EQ section, which is just going to push more high frequencies into this effects processor. Really kind of brightens up our layer. Let's take out those lows because we don't need any lows because we already have a lot of bass. And let's dial back the mids. Then the last thing that we could do is just crank up our amount to add more compression and more saturation. Then the last thing we could do is adjust the output so that way we're not adding so much volume. So this was our whole mix before. And this is our mix after. So with our final mix, we have a lot more depth and clarity within the mix. There's nice high frequency content. The drums have a really nice punch to them with that harmonic distortion that's added in. We get a mix that's a lot more energetic and exciting, but has a bit more texture and distortion like what you would get from an analog mix. So this is a super interesting plugin that I highly recommend taking a look at if you haven't tried it out already, because it could be a lot of fun to use on mix buses, especially when you just want to add a little bit more color and energy to certain parts of a mix.